Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be exploring the life and teachings of Jesus. You've given us some interesting sources to work with.
Yes, Bible study for non-Christians and who is Jesus, exploring his life and teachings. And looks like you're really trying to understand who Jesus was and what his message was all about.
Yeah, it's a question that seems pretty simple on the surface, but when you really start digging into it.
Oh, absolutely. It gets complex quickly. And it's a question that has resonated for centuries. Even within these two sources, we see a real desire to go beyond the surface level.
Okay, so let's dive in. Both sources kind of jump right into this central question, who is Jesus? It's something that people were asking even when Jesus was alive, and it seems like that question is just as relevant today.
Right. And you can see that tension, that debate, even in the Bible itself.
Yeah, like in Matthew.
Yeah, Matthew 16.1 through 16, when Jesus asks his disciples who they think he is, and the conversation that follows really highlights how complicated people saw him.
And that's even before we get into the whole idea that he was both divine and human.
Right.
Like John 1:1-4 describes Jesus as the Word existing with God from the very beginning, but also feeling flesh and living among us. So how can someone be both God and human at the same time?
Well, that's a really central concept in Christianity, the idea that Jesus wasn't just some wise teacher, but that he was actually God choosing to experience the world as a human, feeling joy, pain, temptation, all the things that make us human.
So we have this incredible figure who is both God and man entering the world. But his arrival wasn't totally unexpected, right?
No, not at all. As both sources point out, for generations, the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, had prophesied the coming of a Messiah. Imagine that. For centuries, people waiting for this moment, looking for signs, holding on to hope.
Wow. Yeah, that must have been intense.
And then, as Mark 1.1-8 tells us, John the Baptist arrives, this really intense figure preaching in the wilderness and preparing the way for Jesus. Talk about building anticipation.
I can only imagine what it must have been like to be alive during that time, to actually witness these ancient prophecies being fulfilled. So who was this John the Baptist guy? It sounds like he was pretty important.
Yeah, definitely. He was known as the forerunner.
So I guess that makes him kind of like the opening act, getting the crowd ready for the main event.
Exactly. He was the messenger announcing the arrival of the one they'd been waiting for.
It sounds like a pretty pivotal moment in history. Okay, so we have this long-awaited arrival, this divine and human figure entering the world. But what did he actually do?
Well, both sources really emphasize his role as a teacher, but not just any teacher, a revolutionary one.
How so?
Well, you can see this in Matthew 4.18-25 and 7.24-29, where Jesus calls people from all different parts of society to follow him. Fishermen, tax collectors, people who were usually overlooked or pushed aside. He wasn't just focused on the religious elite. He was building a movement that broke down social and religious barriers.
That's interesting that you call it a movement. It makes it sound like more than just teaching, like he was creating a community, a new way of life.
I think that's a great point. And remember, back then, being someone's disciple wasn't just about listening to them talk. It was about actually living the way they taught you to live. So choosing to follow Jesus meant a pretty radical change in how people lived and interacted with the world.
And speaking of radical, let's talk about his teachings. I mean, redefining purity in Matthew 5.27-30, loving your enemies in Matthew 5.43-45, and talking about the dangers of wealth in Matthew 6.24, he really flipped conventional wisdom on its head.
Absolutely. It was like he was constantly challenging the status quo, pushing people to see things in a completely new light. And what's amazing is how relevant those teachings still are today.
Right.
In a world that's obsessed with material possessions, his words about finding true fulfillment beyond those things, I mean, it's striking, isn't it?
Definitely. It's enough to make you stop and rethink your priorities. But it wasn't just what he said that was radical, was it? Some of his actions were pretty revolutionary, too.
Oh, for sure.
Like his interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well, for example. John 4.4-9.
Yeah, that's a great example of how Jesus broke social barriers. For a Jewish rabbi to even be in Samaria, let alone talking to a Samaritan woman, was completely unheard of, even considered taboo.
It seems like he was intentionally challenging the prejudices of his time, reaching out to someone who was seen as an outsider.
Exactly. And this wasn't a one-time thing either. Both sources highlight how Jesus consistently engaged with people who were marginalized and ostracized by society. He welcomed children, healed lepers, befriended tax collectors, groups of people that were usually avoided or looked down upon.
It's like he was saying that everyone, regardless of their background or social standing, deserves compassion and respect, and that embracing the outcast, in a way, was an act of radical love.
Absolutely. And maybe nothing illustrates this better than the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. It's in John 13.1-5 and 34-35. Just imagine Jesus, a rabbi, a teacher, taking on the role of a servant, humbling himself to wash their feet.
That's a powerful image, especially back then. Washing someone's feet was considered a very low task. It was usually done by servants.
And that's exactly the point. Jesus, the one they called teacher and Lord, was willing to humble himself and perform this act of service. It wasn't just symbolic, it was him living out his own teachings about humility and service.
It really makes you think about how we treat others and what true leadership looks like. So with all of this, have we answered the question, who is Jesus?
Well, I think these sources give us a lot to work with, a lot to ponder.
It feels like we're piecing together a puzzle, don't you think? Each new insight adds another layer of understanding, but there's still so much more to uncover.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We've just scratched the surface of the richness and complexity of his life and teachings.
Let's continue to explore these insights after we take a quick break. You know, it's amazing to think about that act of service with Jesus washing his disciples' feet. It really makes you think about how we can embody those same values of humility and serving others.
Yeah, and that's something that both of these sources really want us to think about. It's not just about learning the history, right?
Right.
It's about how these teachings can actually change the way we live our lives.
Yeah, it's almost like they're saying, okay, you've learned about Jesus now. What are you going to do with that knowledge?
Exactly. And both Bible study for non-Christians and Who is Jesus really emphasize this idea of following Jesus. But, what does that even look like for us today?
Yeah, it's easy to get stuck in that historical context and kind of miss how those teachings can be applied to our own lives.
Right, and it is such a big question. How do we take those teachings about love and service and actually put them into practice in the 21st century?
Yeah, where do we even begin? I mean, what does it actually mean to follow Jesus today?
Well, I think it can be helpful to remember some of the key themes we've already talked about. How Jesus challenged the norms of his society, how he embraced those who were pushed aside and marginalized, and how he demonstrated this radical kind of love that even extended to his enemies.
It's inspiring, but also a bit daunting, right? Like, how can we possibly live up to that?
I know it can feel like a really high bar, but I think it's important to remember that Jesus wasn't about setting impossible rules or expecting us to be perfect. He understood our weaknesses, our flaws. It's more about trying our best to live out those values.
So it's more about the journey, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not about being superhuman, but about making that effort to grow and embody those teachings. So how do we make that happen? Where do we even start?
Well, maybe it starts with looking inward, asking ourselves some tough questions. How can I challenge injustice in my own community? How can I show compassion to those who are different from me? Can I practice forgiveness even when it's hard?
Wow, yeah, those are powerful questions. And it goes beyond just our individual actions, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
It makes you think about your role in society as a whole.
Exactly. Following Jesus isn't passive. It's a call to action, to be a force for positive change, to try to bring hope and love into a world that really needs it.
It's about taking those core values and weaving them into every part of your life, your relationships, your community, the way you interact with the world.
Yeah, and remember, both sources emphasize that we're not in this alone. They talk about the importance of community and surrounding yourself with others who are on this journey.
That's so important. It's like having a support system, people who can encourage you, challenge you, and help you stay grounded. Because living out these teachings isn't always easy, is it?
Definitely not. We all make mistakes. We all stumble. But having a community, people who share your values and can offer guidance, can make a huge difference.
It's like a group of explorers all navigating this new territory together, helping each other along the way. You know what I'm really getting from this is that it's not about just following a set of rules. It's about a real transformation of the heart. It's about choosing to live a life of love, compassion, and making the world a better place.
I like that. That's a powerful way to put it, and that's a legacy worth leaving behind.
Absolutely. It's a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us even all these years later. So we've explored who Jesus was, we've delved into his radical teachings, and we've thought about what it means to follow in his footsteps today. I think we've covered a lot of ground, but...
Oh, we've only just scratched the surface, really.
Right. There's so much more to discover within these sources, so many different interpretations. But it's really up to each person to continue that exploration, to wrestle with these questions and to discover what it all means to them.
It's a personal journey, and that process of discovery and growth is unique to each person.
It's amazing to think that these texts, written so long ago, can still spark these profound questions and reflections. It really is a journey that never ends.
Yeah, it's a lifelong exploration. It's always evolving. Our understanding is always growing.
You've given us so much to think about. We only have a little bit of time left, so let's wrap up with one final thought for our listeners.
I like that.
You know, as we've been talking about Jesus and his impact on the world, it's really striking me how much his teachings go beyond just religion.
Yeah, that's a good point. And both of our sources kind of touch on that too.
Hmm.
Like, even though they're coming from a specifically Christian perspective, those core values they talk about, love, compassion, service, justice, those resonate with people from all sorts of backgrounds.
Right. It's like there's this universal appeal to his message, a kind of timeless wisdom that speaks to us no matter what our beliefs are.
And I think that's part of what makes him such a fascinating figure. He kind of forces us to look beyond these narrow definitions and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's like he's inviting us to engage on all these different levels, personal, social, even spiritual.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so interesting. It opens up space for dialogue and exploration, even for people who don't consider themselves Christian.
It's like we're all trying to figure out what it means to be human, right? To live a good life, to leave the world a little better than we found it. And Jesus offers some pretty powerful insights into those questions, no matter who you are.
For sure. And that's why I think it's important to approach these sources with an open mind. Be willing to listen and learn, even if you don't agree with everything.
It's about having that respectful conversation, understanding that there are all these different perspectives and interpretations.
And through that dialogue, you might find some common ground, shared values, a deeper understanding of each other.
That's a beautiful thought. It's like his teachings can be this bridge, connecting people from different backgrounds, building empathy and understanding.
And maybe that's part of what it means to follow Jesus today. To build those bridges, break down barriers, create a space for compassion and dialogue to grow.
I love that. It's not about converting people. It's about living out those values in a way that brings people together.
It's a challenge for sure, to be a force for unity in a world that feels so divided.
It really is. It reminds us that his message was never just about personal salvation. It was about transforming the world, creating a society that was more just and compassionate.
And that's something we can all work towards. Regardless of what we believe, it's about recognizing that shared humanity, embracing our differences, and working together for a better future.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to say I'm feeling pretty inspired. We've explored the life of someone truly remarkable, someone who's had an incredible impact on the world.
Yeah, and like we keep saying, we've only scratched the surface.
There's so much more to explore, so much more to learn.
It's a journey.
It really is. A journey that's both personal and collective. And it asks us to really engage with our hearts, our minds, and our spirits. So thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep striving to make a difference in the world.